Now, in relation to the BRICS summit, we think that it is a positive step that we are having BRICS, including additional countries in the global south, who are uniting against the undue and long overdue imperialist forces of the West. So we really appreciate that there is now beginning to be bravery and courage of consolidating the global south politically against the imperialist domination of the G7 countries. But we think also that there was a missed opportunity by the African continent to consolidate what we want to achieve pan-continentally as the continent. I mean, like in Agenda 2063, we have got 10 priority projects of the African continent. Number one of those projects is an integrated rail project, the railway project, which is going to enhance and harness intra-African trade. But in none of these platforms which are relevant, the African continent almost always fails to consolidate a common perspective to say that we are looking for these pan-African infrastructure programs and projects, because the African continent will continue to be excluded from mainstream economic benefit because it cannot trade within itself. It cannot expand its economy. It doesn't have infrastructure. The African continent still does not have electricity, does not have a rail project that integrates all of us, doesn't have proper trade corridors that have to be developed. And we are friends with countries such as China, such as Russia, which have got huge capacity to could help in terms of that infrastructure. Of course, countries came to give demands of their own, sub-national or even national demands in terms of what their aspirations are. But we strongly believe that the African continent should have consolidated a common agenda and said that at least out of a summit which is themed BRICS and Africa, let us agree to have a one or two major pan-African infrastructure projects which are going to benefit the continent, because without expanding the infrastructure of the continent and integrating it, we're not going to go anywhere as Africa. We're not going to catch up with the highly developed and industrialized nations of the world. Now look, we have, as the EFF in our previous National People's Assembly resolution, come out with a very clear resolution on calling for the reform of the United Nations. And the context of why the United Nations must be reformed to be representative of the peoples of the world is that when the United Nations was founded in 1945, there were only two countries in the territory called Africa now which were having some relative autonomy, which could participate in the United Nations. And it's now many years later, more than 40 years later, or like more than 70 years later of the United Nations, we've got 53, 54 African countries which do not have meaningful participation in the United Nations. We have to change the manner in which decisions are taken in the United Nations. We have to democratize the United Nations. And we have to reconstitute the United Nations Security Council to be representative of peoples of the world, particularly the African continent, because we are the ones who are excluded the most, and maybe inclusive of Southern America as well, where there is no meaningful participation on a permanent basis in terms of what happens in the UN. So the UN has to be democratized, has to be reformed. And South Africa, in all these platforms that we participate in, whether it's the BRICS, whether it's the Pan-African Parliament, the African Union, the Interparliamentary Union, all these platforms, we should be consolidating the agenda of the reform of the United Nations. It's long overdue. It's a program which we should rally all progressive forces of the world to unite behind. And in the next General Assembly, we should come with a clear resolution that this is what we propose should happen in terms of how the United Nations should be reconstituted and reformed to represent the aspirations and interests of all people of the world. I think it is possible that it can happen in our lifetime. I will tell you, for example, that in the Interparliamentary Union, which is represented by parliaments of more than 170 countries, we as a South African delegation in the IPU have raised the issue of the reform of the United Nations, and we had overwhelming support of the IPU members of parliament from more than 170 countries. What needs to be done is that these assemblies of heads of state and government at AU level and other continental bodies have to consolidate a clear agenda and resolution that must be presented in the United Nations General Assembly so that we then start the process of reform. It will happen in our lifetime. I think with our generation of leadership, it's definitely going to happen because there is also beginning to be a global awakening that we cannot be under the spell and control, total control of the Western agenda, because the essence of the United Nations and even other institutions such as the WTO and the IMF and the World Bank is American imperialist control, which the world is rising up to oppose now. So taking and riding on this wave of a global awakening and a global opposition to Western domination and Western imperialism, let us add into the agenda the question of the reform of the United Nations, and we will become victorious in terms of how we get to reform that particular institution. Now, I've convened the Central Command Team meeting of the EFF to basically do three things. One is to get a detailed report of the 10th anniversary activities, all the programs that have happened thus far. We constantly have to appraise the Central Command Team as to the activities that have happened and the success that we have achieved in terms of celebrating the 10th birthday of the EFF. And then the second issue that we're dealing with today was to workshop and adopt the Road to Victory Manual, which is our election strategy for 2024. And then the last component of our meeting was discussing the manifesto framework as to just how are we going to engage in processes of consultations and interactions with members of the community and different people from different parts of the world in shaping what will become the most cogent and clear manifesto of the EFF in 2024. So those are the key issues that we're deliberating on in this meeting of the Economic Freedom Fighters. It has thus far been a very successful and possibly one of the most productive meetings of the EFF since its formation 10 years ago. Look, we are going to immediately start with the consultation process in regards to the manifesto. We're going to, just on the beginning of September, start the process of calling for public submissions. So in the press conference tomorrow, we're going to outline just how many people and how people are going to gain access to the process of shaping the manifesto of the EFF, because what we want to have out of this process is a people's manifesto. So the engagement process will be far much more open, will be much more organic, will include door-to-door to consult with different communities and different sectors of society, will include the maximal usage of social media and other platforms as well for people who want to make substantial submissions, so that we ultimately produce a manifesto that speaks to the aspirations and desires of the people of South Africa. That is what we're going to do.